By the time most people reach their early 70s, they have lost roughly 5% of their total brain volume, and in some cases, considerably more. That is not a metaphor. It is a measurable physical reality confirmed through neuroimaging studies conducted across populations in the United States, the United Kingdom, and across Europe. The hippocampus, the brain's primary memory consolidation center, can shrink by as much as 1 to 2% per year after the age of 60 in certain individuals. Some studies suggest that process begins far earlier, quietly accelerating through the mid-40s onward. Most people assume this is simply aging. It is not entirely. Here's what I want you to sit with for the next several minutes. The human brain did not evolve to shrink. It evolved to be maintained actively, structurally, at the molecular level by a set of biological inputs that the modern food environment no longer reliably provides. In fact, 3 specific categories of food that now form the backbone of Western diets are doing something far more serious than simply failing to nourish the brain. They are accelerating its physical deterioration. And the timing is not random. After the age of 45, the brain enters a window of particular structural vulnerability, a period when the molecular inputs it depends on matter more than they ever did, and when the damage from dietary misalignment compounds in ways we are only beginning to measure. I am Daniel Lieberman, Harvard professor and evolutionary biologist. I have spent my career studying how the human body evolved to run, eat, think, and survive. Now, I am here to help you understand why your ancient biology struggles in a radically modern world, and how to work with it instead of against it. Welcome to the evolution. If you find this kind of thinking useful, evolutionary reasoning applied to the challenges of modern life, consider subscribing. Not because this channel chases trends, but because the evidence here is worth following carefully. To understand what is happening inside the modern brain after 45, we have to go back, not decades, but hundreds of thousands of years. The human brain is, by any reasonable measure, the most metabolically expensive organ in the known biological world. It constitutes roughly 2% of total body weight. It consumes approximately 20% of all resting metabolic energy. In infants, that figure climbs above 60%. No other mammal on Earth makes this kind of cognitive investment, and it did not happen by accident. The expansion of the human brain over the past 2 million years, from the roughly 400 cubic centimeter brain of early Australopithecus to the approximately 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeter brain we carry today, was directly tied to a shift in dietary composition. Specifically, the reliable acquisition of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, and in particular, docosahexaenoic acid, what most people know simply as DHA, appears to have been structurally essential to that expansion. Here's what makes that significant. DHA is not merely fuel for the brain, it is architecture. Roughly 60% of the dry weight of the human brain is fat. Of that fat, a disproportionate share is DHA, concentrated most heavily in the gray matter of the prefrontal cortex, in the synaptic membranes where neurons communicate, and in the cellular structures of the hippocampus. DHA gives neuronal membranes their fluidity, their flexibility, their capacity to form and reform synaptic connections rapidly. Without adequate DHA, neuronal membranes become less fluid, more rigid, slower to respond. This is not a dietary supplement claim. This is structural biochemistry. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, this requirement was met through diet in ways that aligned naturally with where our ancestors lived and how they foraged. Coastal and riverine populations across Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and elsewhere consumed fish, shellfish, and aquatic mammals regularly. Inland populations accessed DHA through organ meats, particularly brain tissue, which contains extraordinarily high concentrations of this fatty acid. And the fat ratios in wild game differ fundamentally from domesticated animals, leaner, richer in omega-3 fatty acids, and structurally different in ways that matter enormously to the brain. The ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the ancestral diet is estimated to have been somewhere between 2 to 1 and 4 to 1. Today, in populations eating a standard Western diet, that ratio sits somewhere between 15 to 1 and 25 to 1 in many individuals. That shift does not just represent a change in nutrition. It represents a change in the molecular raw material available to construct and maintain the brain itself. And here is the piece most people do not hear enough. The brain is not a static organ. It is continuously remodeling. Synaptic membranes are rebuilt, neural pathways are strengthened or pruned, inflammatory responses are initiated and resolved. All of this requires molecular inputs, and the quality of those inputs determines in part the quality of the structural outcome. Your brain after 45 is not simply aging passively. It is rebuilding itself continuously, using whatever the modern food environment provides, which is where the problem begins. Let us be precise here. I am not going to tell you that bad food is bad for your brain. That is not a useful observation. What I want to examine instead is the specific mechanism by which three food categories exploit evolutionary vulnerabilities in the aging brain. Vulnerabilities that became more pronounced after 45 because of changes in how the aging brain manages inflammation, energy metabolism, and cellular repair. The first food category is industrially refined seed oils. This requires some context because this is a story about molecular displacement, and it is more consequential than most nutrition discussions acknowledge. Refined seed oils, soybean oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, sunflower oil in its standard refined form, are extraordinarily rich in linoleic acid, the primary dietary omega-6 fatty acid. These oils became dominant in Western food systems during the middle of the 20th century, largely through agricultural policy, industrial food processing, and the widespread adoption of processed and fast food. They are now present in nearly every category of packaged food: baked goods, salad dressings, chips, crackers, cooking sprays, restaurant fried foods, margarine-based spreads. Here's the issue. Linoleic acid and DHA compete for the same enzymatic pathways in the body, specifically the elongase and desaturase enzymes responsible for converting and incorporating long-chain fatty acids into cell membranes. When linoleic acid is consumed in very high quantities, it effectively outcompetes the omega-3 pathway. DHA incorporation into neural membranes is reduced. Inflammatory arachidonic acid derivatives produced from excess omega-6 metabolism increase. The result over years of exposure is a gradual but measurable shift in the molecular composition of brain tissue itself. Neuroimaging data from multiple longitudinal studies have found associations between higher ratios of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids and reduced gray matter volume in regions including the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, exactly the areas most vulnerable to age-related cognitive decline. One analysis using data from the UK Biobank found that erythrocyte omega-3 index, a measure of omega-3 status in the blood, was significantly associated with brain volume and cognitive performance in adults over 40. Your body is not failing when it struggles to maintain brain structure on a diet of industrially refined oils. It is doing precisely what it was designed to do, incorporating whatever molecular building material is most available. The design is sound. The inputs are the problem. The second food category is refined grain products and added sugar. Here, the mechanism shifts from molecular displacement to metabolic disruption, and it is one of the most clinically well-documented pathways to structural brain decline now in the literature. The human brain evolved in an environment of caloric uncertainty. Energy-dense foods, ripe fruit, honey, starchy tubers, were available seasonally and inconsistently. The brain's drive to seek and consume sweet, calorie-rich foods was adaptive. Strong preference for these foods drove foraging behavior that kept our ancestors alive through periods of scarcity. That instinct remains entirely intact. But now it operates in an environment where refined carbohydrates, white bread, white rice, pasta made from stripped grains, sugar-sweetened beverages, pastries, breakfast cereals are available continuously in enormous quantities at low cost and high palatability. Consumption of these foods drives rapid, large spikes in blood glucose followed by pronounced insulin responses. In the short term, this is manageable. Repeated across decades, particularly combined with low physical activity, it drives a state of chronic, low-grade insulin resistance. And here is what makes that deeply relevant to brain structure. The brain has its own insulin signaling system. Neurons depend on insulin signaling, not only for glucose uptake, but for synaptic plasticity, neuronal survival signaling, and the clearance of amyloid proteins, the misfolded proteins that accumulate in neurodegenerative conditions. When the brain becomes insulin resistant, that entire cascade is disrupted. Some researchers now refer to advanced Alzheimer's disease as a condition of profound cerebral insulin resistance, colloquially termed type 3 diabetes by a number of neuroscientists, though I use that phrase descriptively rather than as a clinical diagnosis. What is clear is that chronic glycemic disruption is not merely a cardiovascular or metabolic risk factor. It is directly relevant to the structural integrity of the aging brain. A large meta-analysis published in 2023 found that higher habitual glycemic index dietary patterns were associated with significantly faster rates of hippocampal volume loss over time compared to lower glycemic dietary patterns, independent of overall calorie consumption. After 45, the brain's capacity to manage these metabolic insults decreases. Cerebral blood flow regulation becomes less efficient. Neuroinflammatory responses to metabolic stress take longer to resolve. The window of vulnerability widens. The third food category is ultra-processed meat products, specifically commercially produced cured and processed meats. Hot dogs, deli meats produced with nitrite preservatives, canned meat products, and processed sausage products that form the protein foundation of many convenient low-cost diets. The mechanism here is distinct from the previous two. It involves a class of chemical compounds called nitrosamines. Nitrites are added to processed meats as preservatives and color fixers, and under certain conditions, particularly in the acidic environment of the stomach, they can react with amines present in the protein to form nitrosamines. Several nitrosamines are classified as probable or known carcinogens, and a growing body of research now links them to a different and somewhat underappreciated pathway of neural damage, mitochondrial dysfunction in neurons. Neurons are exceptionally energy-demanding cells. They depend on functional mitochondria, the energy-producing organelles within each cell, to sustain synaptic activity, maintain membrane potential, and support the continuous molecular repair processes the brain requires. Nitrosamines appear to interfere with mitochondrial function, specifically in brain tissue, producing patterns of oxidative stress and insulin resistance within neurons that some researchers believe mirror early neurodegenerative processes. Research conducted at Brown University by Dr. Suzanne de la Monte, examining the effects of nitrosamine compounds on brain tissue, found patterns of damage consistent with what is observed in early neurodegenerative disease: impaired insulin signaling in neurons, increased oxidative stress, and disrupted energy metabolism. The work suggests that long-term dietary exposure to nitrosamine precursors may be a meaningful contributor to the broader pattern of age-related cognitive decline, particularly in populations with high processed meat consumption. That is not a reason for alarm, it is a reason for attention. 3 food categories, 3 distinct biological mechanisms. One shared outcome: accelerated structural deterioration of the very tissue the human brain spent 2 million years elaborately constructing. Let us step back for a moment. If you remember nothing else, remember this: the human brain is not aging passively. It is continuously rebuilding itself, and the structural quality of that rebuilding depends entirely on what you regularly provide it at the molecular level. 3 food categories now widespread in modern Western diets are actively undermining that process through displacement, metabolic disruption, and cellular energy interference. This is not weakness. It is evolutionary design meeting an environment it was never prepared for. Now let us go one layer deeper, because the most important insight here is not simply about the 3 foods. It is about what happens in the brain after 45 that makes these inputs so much more consequential than they were at 30. Here's what most people miss entirely. The conversation around midlife brain health tends to focus almost exclusively on what to add: more omega-3 supplements, more antioxidants, more cognitive training exercises. But the more important question is about a shift in the brain's internal economy that occurs in the mid-40s, a shift that changes how vulnerable the brain becomes to exactly the inputs we have been discussing. Researchers studying brain metabolism using positron emission tomography, PET scanning, have made a striking observation over the past decade. In a significant proportion of cognitively normal adults, brain glucose metabolism begins to decline during the mid-40s. This is not confined to people who are metabolically unhealthy. It is observed across populations, and it appears to precede any detectable cognitive change by as much as 10 to 15 years in some cases. In other words, the metabolic infrastructure of the brain begins to shift before any symptom is visible. The leading hypothesis, advanced by researchers including Dr. Lisa Mosconi at Weill Cornell Medicine, is that this reflects a transition in the brain's preferred fuel source. Under optimal ancestral conditions, the aging brain shifts gradually toward a greater reliance on ketone bodies, produced from fat metabolism, as a supplemental energy substrate. This is not a modern invention. It appears to be an ancient metabolic adaptation, a biological hedge against periods of dietary carbohydrate scarcity, which were common in ancestral environments. What happens when a brain attempting to make this metabolic transition encounters a continuous flood of refined carbohydrates, elevated insulin, displaced omega-3 architecture, and mitochondrial disruption from nitrosamine exposure? The transition stalls. The brain's backup energy system in the ketone pathway requires metabolic flexibility that chronic hyperinsulinemia actively suppresses. Insulin directly inhibits fat mobilization and ketone production. A brain caught in a chronic high glucose, high insulin dietary environment at exactly the moment it needs to develop greater metabolic flexibility is a brain being denied the very adaptation it was designed to make. This is, I think, one of the most underappreciated mismatches in the entire field of brain aging. Think about what this means practically. Consider a retired educator, someone who spent 30 years in intellectually demanding work, who is not sedentary, who follows general health guidelines reasonably well, but whose diet has quietly accumulated decades of refined grain staples, cooking with standard vegetable oils, and regular deli sandwich lunches. She is not eating what most people would call a terrible diet. She is eating a thoroughly normal modern diet. And her brain at 58 is attempting a metabolic transition that a continuous stream of refined carbohydrates and industrially processed fats is quietly obstructing. While simultaneously lacking the molecular architecture inputs it needs to maintain synaptic density in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, she may not notice anything yet. The brain has remarkable compensatory capacity, but the structural divergence between what her brain is building and what it evolved to build is real, and it is accumulating. This is the deeper issue, not dramatic, sudden decline, quiet divergence from structural potential. And here is the culturally contrarian observation worth sitting with. This is not primarily a story about individual discipline or personal failure. It is a story about an industrial food system that systematically replaced the molecular inputs the human brain evolved to require with cheaper, shelf-stable, highly palatable alternatives, and did so in a period of 60 to 80 years, far too fast for any biological adaptation to respond. The brain did not change. The food supply changed. I want to be careful here because this section is not a prescription and I am not your physician. What I can offer is an evolutionary framework for thinking clearly about environment design. The evolutionary lens does not tell us to pursue extreme dietary protocols. It tells us to reduce the gap between what our biology expects and what our environment actually provides. That is a meaningful but achievable shift for most people, and it is far more sustainable than willpower-dependent restriction. The first and most structurally important step is reducing the displacement of omega-3 fatty acids in the brain's building material. This does not require supplements necessarily. It requires changing the fat that is most consistently present in the diet, replacing refined seed oils in cooking and food preparation with fats that do not compete destructively with the omega-3 pathway. Olive oil, for instance, which is high in oleic acid and does not exacerbate the omega-6 displacement problem, meaningfully changes the molecular raw material available to the brain over months and years. Including regular oily fish, sardines, mackerel, herring, wild-caught salmon, provides the preformed DHA the brain can incorporate directly without relying on the conversion pathway that becomes increasingly inefficient with age. In populations where fresh fish is cost prohibitive, canned sardines and mackerel are among the most affordable and nutritionally dense options available. The evolutionary design does not require expensive solutions. The second reframe is about glycemic pattern rather than glycemic restriction. The brain does not need to be starved of carbohydrate. It needs carbohydrate delivered in forms that do not produce the repeated high-amplitude glucose spikes that drive insulin resistance and suppress metabolic flexibility. Intact whole grains, legumes, root vegetables, these are not the problem. The problem is the wholesale displacement of those ancestral carbohydrate sources by refined and processed equivalents stripped of fiber, protein, and the structural complexity that slows digestion. A consistent dietary pattern built around lower glycemic, higher fiber carbohydrate sources is not a trendy intervention. It is a structural restoration of what the brain's metabolic system evolved to receive. The third reframe is more straightforward. Processed and cured meats do not need to dominate the protein architecture of the diet. They are convenient, they are deeply embedded in food culture, and this is not about eliminating them entirely. But their role as daily dietary staples, which is how they function in a substantial portion of Western diets, creates a chronic low-level exposure to nitrosamine precursors that the brain does not need. Replacing them with less processed protein sources most of the time is not deprivation. It is simply reducing an unnecessary burden on the neural environment. None of this requires optimizing. It requires adjusting the environment so that the brain's ancient molecular requirements are met with reasonable consistency. I want to return briefly to the deeper evolutionary principle because it is easy to hear this kind of information and translate it immediately into anxiety about every food choice. That is not the right frame. Your body is not fragile. It is a system built to function under variable and imperfect conditions. The brain has significant resilience, significant compensatory capacity, and a remarkable ability to respond to improved inputs, even in later life. Multiple studies now show that dietary pattern changes in adults over 50 produce measurable changes in inflammatory biomarkers, omega-3 indices, and in some cases, brain volume trajectories over periods as short as 12 to 18 months. The brain is not locked in, it is continuously remodeling. The question is simply what raw materials you are consistently providing for that remodeling. This is the profound insight of evolutionary biology applied to aging. You are not managing decline. You are managing alignment between an ancient system and a modern environment, and that alignment is more within your influence than most conversations about aging suggest. I want to return to where we began. I told you that by most people's 70s, the brain has undergone measurable physical volume loss, and I asked you to sit with the possibility that this is not simply an inevitable feature of biological aging. Let me be precise about what I mean by that. I am not suggesting that all brain aging is preventable. I am not claiming that dietary change reverses cognitive decline that has already occurred. I am not making promises about disease prevention. What the evidence supports is something more measured and I think more useful than those claims. The rate and degree of structural brain decline in the modern Western world appears to significantly exceed what is driven by aging alone. The gap between what the brain is capable of maintaining with adequate molecular inputs and what it actually maintains in many people eating standard modern diets is meaningful. And a portion of that gap is influenced by consistent dietary patterns accumulated over decades. 3 food categories are doing genuine, measurable structural harm to the aging brain, not through catastrophic events, through quiet, cumulative molecular displacement, metabolic disruption, and cellular energy interference, operating across the exact period of life when the brain's own compensatory systems are under the most evolutionary pressure. Here's what I find most compelling about this from a scientific standpoint. The solution does not require a radical departure from normal human life. It requires a return toward the general dietary composition that allowed a 2 million year process of neural expansion to occur in the first place. More preformed omega-3 fatty acids from aquatic and fatty animal sources. Carbohydrates delivered in intact, lower glycemic forms that preserve metabolic flexibility. A reduction in the novel chemical load introduced by industrial preservation techniques. That is not an extreme program. That is closer to the ancestral mean. Your brain did not shrink because you lack willpower. It did not drift from its structural potential because of personal failure. It is operating exactly as an evolved biological system should, responding to the inputs most consistently available in its environment. The instinct that drives you toward convenient, palatable, energy-dense food is not weakness. It is ancient design operating in a novel context. What feels like cognitive vulnerability in midlife and beyond is often ancient design meeting an environment that has drifted too far from the conditions that created it. Understanding that gap is the first meaningful step toward closing it. In the next video, I want to examine something that follows naturally from today's conversation, the question of physical activity and the brain, because the relationship between movement and brain structure is not simply about cardiovascular health. It involves a set of molecular signaling pathways that are, if anything, even more directly tied to the brain's structural maintenance program than diet alone. And the evolutionary story behind that connection is one that I think most people have never fully heard. Thank you for thinking through this carefully.